Good morning. Can folks hear me? Yeah, it does sound a little different. That's good. Well, you're going to have a double dose of me this morning. We hope that it'll be for the better. And I am going to try something a little bit different. We've got the screen up. I won't have too many slides for you. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to project on a screen, because what I will do with the few slides that will be shown is highlight some of the main points, essentially the main scriptures. So if you want to take notes, if you are taking notes, when certain screens come up, you can write down those scriptures and then read them on your own with respect to the context of the discussion this morning. So I hope you will take advantage of that, and that we don't have any glitches this morning with the PowerPoint. And if we do, that's okay, because I've got all my notes strewn about up here. Yeah, you saw that? All the yellow. I'm going to start off with a short story this morning. As many of you are aware, the family took a trip to Maui earlier this year. And we were able to find a congregation of the Lord's Church. We found it was called the Aloha Church of Christ. In fact, it's still called the Aloha Church of Christ. And it was a unique experience because they did not have a building. And they were basically in a park very close to a beach. And you might think, well, that's distracting, that might be hard. Well, it wasn't that bad. We were set back from the beach, so you don't have the noise of the wind and the waves on you. We were in the shade of the trees, and the preacher, his name is Stan Frank. And Libby and I knew him, maybe about 5 years ago. We'd met him before, so we knew this preacher from a previous visit. And he, very kind, him and his wife are just rock solid in the church. They are some of the kindest, most gracious people you will meet. And he had some chairs set up in the grass, and he had a little stand, much like a music stand, if I recall correctly, which he had his notes, his Bible on, just a little tiny portable podium type of thing. And he recorded his preaching too, so he had a little tripod set up with his camera, and so he'd push record and then he'd get going. So very simple. A very interesting experience too, because it was open. People were walking by in the park while we were worshiping that morning, and they could hear us singing, they could see us worshiping. And it's oftentimes within the closed walls, it's just a group of us, no one's looking in from the outside. And that was a very different feeling, to realize that people could be looking in at you from the outside. And it's much like how Christ lived, in a sense, and much like how they went to the synagogues and preached in those early days of the church. Everybody could interact with him, everybody could see and witness. One of the people who was worshiping with us, he was actually a homeless individual and lived in the woods just behind the park. And he came and he was worshiping regularly, it appeared, with that congregation as well. I got to talking with Stan, and sometimes personalities seem to draw, and I seem to be drawn to him, as a brother in Christ. And toward the end of the conversation, he said, "Oh, have I given you this book?" And I'm like, no, I would know if he'd given me a book, because I love my books. Even if I have trouble reading them through, I usually will find places where I can reference books. So having a book is a little bit of a treasure for me. I love my books. And so I would have known and remembered. And so I said, no, I didn't. And he went and grabbed this book. this one right here. And he said, I think you will find this valuable. I think you'd like this. So he gave me this book, and it is titled From Riches to Poverty to Glory, A Study of the Life of Christ by H.B. Frank Jr. So H.B. Frank Jr. was his father. So Stan's dad. Both of his parents really were missionaries. And they also had polio. So they couldn't really walk. They had wheelchairs, etc. And they were all over the place. They were in Europe. They'd been in Jerusalem. They were missionaries in England as well. In fact, Stan's wife has a British accent, so I assume she is from those isles. And he wrote this book. And I believe at one point in time it was used as a textbook. I'm talking decades ago. I think it was Freed Hardeman. But anyway, his dad wrote this book, and it's a very thorough account of Christ's life. It covers his life in chronological order. It also gives a descriptive commentary. It provides background information emphasizing historical, geographical, and first century cultural context. And so I brought it home. I started to read it a little bit. I was really excited. I didn't wait to start reading it. I was reading it while we were still on vacation. And so as I started going through it, and you start checking things, you see these facts, I'm going to double, fact check some of this, and it's rock solid. This is a good book. It's the only copy I have, and I don't know how many more he has, but I know it's no longer in print. His dad passed away a while back. This may be, I think, the second edition, perhaps. They never came out with the third. And it is just an absolute treasure from what I've read so far. It's divided into 12 chapters. It highlights circumstances comparing the Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we can call that MMLJ for short. Have anyone heard that before? MMLJ? It's just for the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But the idea is that it provides this context to properly interpret Scriptures. This is not the typical harmony of the Gospels. So if you've ever heard of a harmony of the Gospels, usually you have several tables, 4 tables, one for each Gospel, and it talks about where Matthew said this, and then Luke said the same thing, and then John said it similarly over here, and then you can kind of cross-reference through the Gospels the different accounts and how they describe the same accounts of Jesus' life. So yes, that's covered in here, but it's more than that. It's not just to help us understand the teachings of Jesus, but what prompted those teachings and how this harmony of the Gospels, so to speak, how it provides a unsurpassable evidence that the Scripture indeed was inspired and is without error. And you can, just from those 4 Gospels, speak that for the entire Bible. So we will also be covering some of the more difficult sayings at points in time. So some of the things that even his disciples struggled with, some of the Scriptures. The idea with going through this study of the life of Christ in this way is to help us get the big picture. We will be covering a lot of minute details, but remember there's a big picture that we want to gather here. We want to understand Christ's life. What was it like for him? What was it like for the disciples? Why did he say and do the things that he did? This goes beyond just the teachings, but gives you the foundation for the teachings. And by doing this, we're going to have a better understanding of the character of Christ himself and of his disciples. And it will help us understand better God's will for us today. So the hope, the goal in this particular study is that we can gain insight into the scriptures that we have often read. I think we've all been through these gospel accounts. To gain greater insight into that, and ultimately to grow closer to the author of our salvation. So with that said, today we are going to start with chapter 1. This is the first chapter of the book, and as I said, I'm using the book as a guide. It's not the only source that I'm using, so I will use other materials throughout this study to supplement, to complement what the book is covering. It will probably take quite a while to get through the entire book, so I am summarizing a fair bit of it. I won't be going into all of the full detail that the book provides, but we will be covering all of the aspects of it to some degree. So chapter 1 focuses primarily on the background to the life of Christ, the preparation for the coming Messiah. That was Christ and is Christ. So if you will, we will start in 1 Peter chapter 1. We'll read verses 18 through 20. I am using the King James Version, but if there is a comment that somebody has and you want to make from another version that you have, feel free to chime in. Just note that the verbiage will be slightly different, most likely, from what I'm reading, if you don't have King James. Verse 18 of chapter 1. For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Here's the key here. Who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who by him do believe in God, that raised him up from the dead, and gave him glory, that your faith and hope might be in God. This is a very interesting point. God planned to send the Messiah to redeem the world, to redeem us, even before the world was created. That's quite a stunning point to make here. Let me read verse 20 one more time. Who, that means Christ, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world. There are other scriptures. Go ahead, Mary.
Mine reads, he was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. That's a little bit simpler.
Right. And we will be covering these points later, but Christ was actually there when the world was made. He made the world even, and we will see those scriptures later on. But the foresight of God. Remember in past studies and past sermons and other people who have preached here, we've covered topics like this where God is not limited by time, where God is all-knowing and ever-present and all-powerful. God knows what's going to happen. And he knew that humanity would fail, that humanity would come short. And he had Christ planned even before the earth was created. What an astounding realization for the love that God has for us. That knowing that we would come short, he had this pre-planned. Point number 2 for the preparation of the coming Messiah. Let's take a look at the book of Luke. Luke chapter 24. And we'll read in verse 27. Now, Christ has just resurrected from the dead. This is post-crucifixion. He's resurrected. And he's talking. He's talking to some of those that were his followers, that are and that remain to be his followers. Luke 24, verse 27. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded or explained unto them in all of the scriptures the things concerning himself. He's talking about all of the hundreds of prophecies that you can find in the Old Testament that spoke to him. He explained it all to them upon his resurrection. Yes, Yubi?
American Standard says interpreted.
Interpreted, that's
all
a...
the scriptures.
Yes, expounded, explained, interpreted. So even those who may have read the Old Testament, who knew the Old Testament, they might have read that stuff but not understood it. Remember Philip and the eunuch? The eunuch didn't understand. Philip had to explain, had to interpret for him. And so this is what Christ did. And he explained all of it, all of those scriptures. So the prophets had been foretelling of his coming for centuries. And here, upon his resurrection, Christ explained all of that and how all that made sense. And we can go through the New Testament and find all of that evidence for it. In different places, it would be its own study, of course. So, he had this pre-planned. He had the Messiah pre-planned, even before the world was created. Prophecies had been given for centuries prior to his advent on earth, if you will. Let's take a look at Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. That adoption, salvation. The fullness of the time. What is the fullness of the time? Any thoughts? God's appointed time is the fullness of the time. It's the time that God deemed to be the right time. It was time at that point in time for God's people to advance to a level of spiritual maturity that they had not yet attained, and to give the rest of the world that open invite and opportunity as well. I don't know if any of you are familiar. There are a number of different commentaries to the Bible out there. There is one commentary I happen to like. It's called Kaufman. You may or may not have heard of Kaufman. He does a fairly thorough job, and he spoke to this fullness of time. And I quote, "All of the grand events of God's plan for the redemption of mankind were scheduled in advance, even the final judgment." Even the final judgment? Well, let's take a look at that. Let's go to Acts chapter 17 to verify that. Acts chapter 17, verse 31. "Because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained," Christ, "whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, that he hath raised him from the dead." Let's take a quick look. "He hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness." So it was already, before the world was made, the Messiah was intended to come. God had it planned from beginning to end. For all of the time, for all of this material world that we here know. He planned for Christ to come to save us, and he has already planned the day of judgment, that day which we do not yet know which day it is, but he has already scheduled it in advance. So the fullness of time in God's time, not ours. We can guess at it, we can think about it, but it is still on God's schedule. But speaking of time, speaking of the fullness of time, we can just look at history to know that the time was right for Christ to come to the earth. Why did Christ come at this particular place at a particular time in history? Well, the time did have to be right. It had to be the fullness of time in a sense. We had to have religious, political, and cultural mix that was right and ripe for Christ's coming to preach to the world. There were factors that historically we can look at and say, oh, this makes sense. This was the perfect time for Christ to come for the spread of the gospel. Some of these factors include the wide dispersion of the Jews. The Jews had been spread far and wide. Remember when the kingdom of Israel was split? You had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. We're talking like nearly, like 900 something BC when this is starting to happen. When they were captured by, the northern kingdom was first captured by the Assyrians, and then the southern kingdom captured by the Babylonians. They started getting spread out. So by the time you get to this point in the Roman Empire, with the Greek culture that they had at the time, the Jews were pretty widespread. We also had the rise of synagogue worship following the Babylonian exile. So after being exiled to Babylon, and only a remnant ever actually returning, the Jews were not only widespread, but we started seeing synagogues pop up in all the cities. There was a contact with the Greek culture and a universal use of the Greek language. We know that the New Testament has been written in Koine Greek. That was the original language. That was a very short-lived language. It came about a few hundred years before Christ and only lasted a few hundred more. It was a short-lived language. And because it was short-lived, it was not allowed to really change. You think about the English language over the hundreds of years that we've had English, and would we understand somebody back in the 14th century? If we were just talking with them, would we understand each other very well? I think there'd be a major language barrier. We didn't have that happen with Koine Greek. So having a very particular language at that particular time gave us the ability to have scriptures for which we can look up the meaning of the original words and understand exactly what was meant. God's will is known. We just have to read it. It did not get altered by the changing of language over time. We also had the Roman Empire, and at that point in time, you would say there was relative peace throughout the Roman Empire. They had established the empire. It was strong. They were at their peak. It was a stable empire. And so you had stability. You had peace to a certain degree. Maybe not the peace that we think of here in Idaho, but it was a stable empire. They were well established. They were at their peak. And so you had this one rule, one governing power that made it possible for folks to understand. So you think about all of the references to the Roman Empire throughout the New Testament. We know what the Roman laws were like. There's no confusion there. And because we had stability and peace in the Roman Empire, part of that was also established by Roman roads. So we had the ability to travel. People had the ability to travel at that time. And the Roman roads are still out there today in places. They lasted ages. And you could go into the engineering design for how they built those roads to last. We won't cover that here. But safe to say that even though they could be rough roads, they were well established, and so people could travel. You could travel throughout the Roman Empire and teach and preach Christ. much easier than you could have before the Roman Empire. We also had expectations. People were expecting the Messiah to come. So this is another historical factor that's important to note. Let's take a look very quickly at Luke as well, at the Luke chapter 2. We can see, I'll read Luke chapter 2, verses 25 and then 38. Starting in verse 25. Thus hath the Lord dealt with me in the days wherein he looked on me to take away my reproach among men. And we're talking here in the context of Jesus' birth being foretold. Let's take a look in verse 38 of Luke chapter 2. And Mary said, Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word. And the angel departed from her. People were already expecting the Messiah, and the angel Gabriel here is explaining to Zacharias and explaining to Joseph and Mary. And they understand because they're already expecting a Messiah to come. We can see that also with the woman at the well. So it wasn't just Jews who expected. Samaritans were expecting a Messiah too. So those are just, there's more historical factors that we could consider. Those are just a highlight of a few of them. But the time, that fullness of time, it really was right. Even if you're just a historian that doesn't believe, you might ask yourself, why did Christ become so popular? Why is he throughout the earth today? And those are just a short list of some of the factors that would be an easy and even just an easy explanation why, just from a historical standpoint, not even looking at the scriptures. You don't have to even be a believer. You just have to look at the facts of history to know that Christ spread throughout the world like he is today because the conditions at that time it was just the perfect alignment.
So, question.
Yes, sir.
When you said the Roman, they were structured, but there was peace. But there wasn't peace for the Christians.
There was not peace for Christians.
They could travel good, but they couldn't go around preaching much because it was a constant. The Pharisees were definitely after them and stopping them at every turn.
Absolutely.
So it was a tough time to be a Christian.
You're also under, even though there was a Senate, you're also under the Emperor of Rome. So it was a very autocratic type of situation. There were also many living in what we would call third world conditions today. That was very common in the Roman times. So yes, you are absolutely correct. It was not easy for the Christians. That said, all of the other historical factors put together, and with the faith of those who did believe, it couldn't be stopped.
Right.
But good point.
And that's what Nicodemus said. If it's from God, in Acts, if it's from God, you can't stop it.
That's right.
But it allowed the gospel to spread throughout the world because of the laws and the power of the Roman armies. They kept the sea lanes open, and you could travel safely most places.
Correct. And even the Apostle Paul made use of his citizenship of Rome to his advantage to keep preaching the gospel. So, yes, Christians did not have it easy early on. They had it much more difficult than we do today. However, all of the historical factors combined, like you say, it just made for the perfect blossom of that flower for the gospel to spread. So it could not be stopped. But let's take a look. Go ahead, Dan.
Real quick, I made a mistake. Not Nicodemus, but Gamaliel.
Gamaliel.
Yeah, Gamaliel. How do you say it? Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
That's correct. Gamaliel was able to, simmer that situation down so it didn't escalate. So yes, Gamaliel said that if it is from God, it cannot be stopped. So let's move on to the political setting, the political situation in that time, particularly in Palestine. And this is the country in which Jerusalem is capital. We can go back to, has anyone heard of the Maccabees, that family of Jews? There was a family, they were under one called Judas Maccabeus, the Jews won liberty from the Syrians and enjoyed independence from 167 to 63 BC. So I know this is a bit of history lesson here, but Syria was part of, it was just a territory, an area of the Greek and even Roman Empire. And the Jews, remember, they had been exiled. They've never really truly been free. Well, the Maccabean period oftentimes is associated with the intertestamental period, so post-Malachi, pre-Matthew, so the last Old Testament book to the first New Testament book. But the Maccabean period started when Mattathias, he was a priest. He led a revolt against the Hellenistic efforts of King Antiochus I. Okay, back up. Hellenistic, what are we talking about here? So we had the ancient Greek culture called Classical Greek, but then in the later times toward the end, at the very end of the Greek time, their rule, it was called the Hellenistic time. So Hellenistic, all that does is refer to the Greek history and culture in the latter times of the Greek Empire. And so they had the king of the Syrian area, so he was a Syrian king. His name was King Antiochus IV. He had it against the Jews at that time. He did not like them. In fact, he attempted to destroy the entire religion. And he ordered the destruction of their scriptures. He abolished the Sabbaths and their festivals. He basically got rid of the food laws. He banned all of their food laws. So remember what was clean food, dirty food, he banned all that. So their food laws were not applicable. He even was trying to get rid of circumcision, which of course to them was their covenant with God. And he was trying to destroy the entire religion in every way he could find to do so. And probably the straw of the camel's back, if you will, was when he desecrated the temple by sacrificing swine on their altar. As we know, at that time, swine or pig, that was something that was unclean. It was not a food that they were allowed to eat under the old law. And he desecrated the temple by sacrificing swine on that. That's pretty much, from what I could tell and what I read, the turning point where the Jews are like, enough's enough, we're revolting. And so they went into warfare, primarily guerrilla warfare. And 3 years later, King Antiochus IV, he withdrew his ban on the Jewish religion. So they got really mad. They fought for 3 years, and he's like, I've had enough of this. I'm just gonna back off now. And that happened right around that 164 BC, where that formally took place. And the temple was rededicated, the Jewish temple. So to commemorate their independence, which only lasted maybe from that time to about 63 BC, so not very long, but to commemorate that, there is this thing called the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Lights. Let's take a look in the book of John. John chapter 10, verse 22. John chapter 10, verse 22 reads, "And it was at Jerusalem, the feast of the dedication, and it was winter." Did you know, we know that Feast of Dedication, or that Feast of Lights, is something else today. They call it Hanukkah. So, if you really think about it, I guess Hanukkah predated Christmas. But just an interesting historical fact. Point being, under Judas Maccabeus, they did win their liberty from the Syrians. And the Jews did enjoy a period of time of liberty prior to Christ's advent. But what happened during this time? Well, we had appointments for the office of the high priest. That changed. So they would always traditionally It was made by heredity, so if your father was a high priest, there was a good chance that you could get appointed high priest if you kept your nose clean. Appointments for the office of the high priest during this time of liberty did change a little bit. It became more one of bribes and leverages for power. It became more political. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, we've all heard of them. We've read about them throughout the Gospels. Well, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they started developing at this time too. And they even took opposing sides because they didn't believe the same things. Well, the Sadducees, for example, they would intermingle with foreigners, but the Pharisees, they kept themselves withdrawn and separated from foreigners. So that was just one difference. We'll take a look at other differences further on. And right around that 63 BC, this is about the time when the Roman Empire is really starting to affect the Jews. There was a man, he was a Roman general, he was also a statesman. His name was Pompey. You may have heard of Pompey from your old history classes. He is accounted as one of the influential figures of history that actually developed the Roman Empire, that made it come into being and become successful. So he came to Jerusalem around 63 BC, and at that time, that area, which formerly Syria, was made tributary to Rome and subject to the oversight of the legate, or the governor or official. So there was a Roman governor or official put over that area in Jerusalem. Let's take a look at Luke chapter 2. And the reason I do this is because a lot of these historical facts, we can find these in scriptures. It's not just the history books. We can corroborate a lot of this straight from Scripture. Luke chapter 2, the first 2 verses. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. I have that in parentheses as verse 2 in my version. And of course, in verse 3, and all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. So that was under the direction of the Roman governor. And this is the setting into which Jesus was born. He was born at a time when this area was under Roman rule. Remember Herod the Great? There's a bunch of Herods. There's a whole pile of them. And from what I could tell, it's hard to find a nice one. Herod the Great was not nice. Following the death of his father, Herod the Great became king of that area. He actually was of Jewish descent. I wouldn't care to make a guess as to what he really believed, but he was of Jewish descent. He was rejected and historically by Jews because he wasn't of the right lineage. He was one of those appointments, one of those political appointments, because he was appointed king, but under Roman rule. So he's got this fine balance. He's got to play to the Jews. He's also trying to play to the Romans. And there's a fine balance when you're a king of an area or you're a governor or a magistrate over an area. Well, he did evidently have sympathy to the Jews because he began rebuilding Zerubbabel's temple. Oh no, I said this big name. Let's go back to Haggai. Haggai, chapter 1. Who is Zerubbabel? Haggai chapter 1. We'll read the first 2 verses. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Josedek the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. So we're going back a few hundred years here, obviously. But Herod the Great, he started rebuilding the temple. This would be the second temple. This was a temple that was started in 538 BC, when we go back to here in Haggai. And this is also the same temple that was mostly completed in Herod's lifetime. It was completed in 67 AD. Oh, actually, yeah, I think it was 67 AD. Remember, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD? I may have that 67 wrong. I think it's right. But it was, remember in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed? So this is the same temple. So the temple that's been destroyed, they've tried to rebuild it. Well, Herod, probably it was about 1920 BC, 19 to 20 BC, he started rebuilding that temple. And it was the same temple that was destroyed by about 70 AD. So Herod the Great did have sympathetic feelings toward the Jews, and maybe it was more towards a political sense, I couldn't guess. But he did start rebuilding the temple. It was the same one that was destroyed about 70 AD. Now, as far as his character goes, he was not a good person. It says that he killed his favorite wife. I don't understand that. Her name was Mariamne. He also killed 3 of his sons. He killed an uncle. And remember in Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 and following, he killed the male infants of Bethlehem. Why? Because of the prophecies concerning Christ. He heard about that. And he didn't want someone to be king instead of him. Because he didn't understand the kingship of our Lord Christ. Well, Herod died in about 4 BC. And by the time Jesus' public ministry began, Pontius Pilate, as you all may have heard that name, particularly maybe in Acts, as well as in the Gospels. Pontius Pilate became the governor in that area, and you can see that in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. So to summarize, there are a lot of historical factors. God had planned the Messiah to come from the beginning. He's already planned the final judgment. There were a lot of historical factors in play. We see the background in the years leading up to the advent of Christ himself. And we see some of the political setting changing when the Maccabees won the Jewish freedom under Syrian rule in 167 BC, 164. And it was short-lived, but during that time, certain things started to develop. And then the Roman Empire came in and started influencing the area shortly before Christ was born. So hopefully you find this of use. We will continue this. Once we get through some of the background, I think it will get a little bit more exciting for you as we delve more into the teachings and sayings of Christ. But understanding the setting, understanding the historical setting, the political setting, the religious setting. We'll get into the religious setting and the cultural setting in our next class. Thank you for your attention.